But for those of you who are coming from different outside of Emanu-El, I'm Rabbi Jonathan Singer, one of the senior rabbis here at the synagogue. And I'm so honored to have as our guest this morning, at night for him, MK Rabbi Gilad Kariv, who is a friend and just an inspiring leader of the Jewish people, and has taken on the task of being the first Reform Rabbi, the first non-Orthodox rabbi, correct me if I'm wrong on that, Gilad, to be a member of Knesset, the unicameral parliament of the state of Israel. As you probably know, folks out there, the Knessets are made up of coalition governments. No one in the history has ever had a majority government of 61 seats. So Gilad's part of the Labor Party, and we'll ask him to explain why he made that choice, and rose up high in the listing during the election and made it in this very special coalition, a historic coalition that is governing the land of Israel right now. Before being a politician and a leader in that regard, Gilad was the president and CEO of the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism. He was one who helped build up Reform synagogues throughout the land of Israel, something that other people didn't think could be done because there's such an anathema against any expression of Judaism other than orthodoxy, because the power of religion in the state was given early on by socialist anti-religious Jews themselves to these very religious Jews, thinking that they would ultimately disappear and join the socialist nirvana of being non-religious. Little did they know that they would grow in such power. And so Gilad, who grew up in Israel and was enamored with a way of expressing Judaism that reflected modernity, joined the Reform movement after law school, I believe, went to rabbinical school. And so Gilad, you carry with yourself these multiple titles of rabbi, of attorney, and now a member of Knesset, Saver Knesset. And we know that you've been asked by all kinds of synagogues in the United States to give talks like this. And the fact that you're so busy, people may notice that you're in your car, that you're just coming home from a late night session in the Knesset for whatever reason. But we are grateful. We see you as a leader for us and bringing the diaspora voice and concerns from a Reform and non-Orthodox perspective, but religious perspective, or Jewish people perspective to Am Yisrael. So thank you for taking the time to meet with us. And let me just throw it right out. What has it been like for you to be the first Reform rabbi in Israel's history to sit in the Knesset? And what's the symbolic significance of the role you're playing? And how have you dealt with the reception, so to speak, by the opposition?
So first of all, good afternoon, dear friends. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to have this opportunity to address all of you. I'm carrying with me many good memories from my visits to San Francisco. As the rabbi knows, I have a brother nearby in Oakland. He's an economy professor in Berkeley. And I visited your lovely city and mainly your amazing congregation many times. And I want to take this opportunity first to express my gratitude to the long friendship we have with Temple Emanu-El, with its rabbinical leadership, your rabbis, and the leadership of the congregation. I need, first of all, I apologize for having this session with you for my car. As Rabbi Jonathan said, I'm on my way back from the Knesset. I'm now chairing the Knesset Committee for Constitutional Matters, Law and Order. And this committee became to be basically the COVID-19 committee of the Israeli parliament. And we are dealing with most of the government regulations around the pandemic and the different ways that the government and the public health system are trying to deal with this health crisis, and it keeps us quite busy. This pandemic in the parliament. First, I need to admit that the dream to become an Israeli politician, a member of the Israeli Knesset, is older than my dream to become a Reform Rabbi. As a very young kid, I became to be deeply interested in Israeli politics. It was always an area of interest for me. I discovered progressive Judaism, Reform Judaism, when I finished my high school and during my years of service in the IDF, but I became to be a political activist few years before, during my high school years, and since then, I placed myself in this ideological political circle of the Israeli Zionist left. When I became to be a Reform Israeli Jew, and then to became one of the leaders of the Israeli Reform movement, it was quite comfortable for me to remain in this political circle, because historically this political group in Israel is a long supporter of the right for freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, and without suggesting that we don't have good friends in right-wing parties like the Likud, I think that historically our best political allies were the Zionist left parties, including my party, the Labour Party. And in that regard, I think it's not a surprise that the first party in Israel to introduce a Reform Rabbi as a candidate, and the first Israeli party to have a Reform Rabbi in its list in the parliament is the Labour Party. Now, the truth is that the transition was quite intensive. I'm sure that most of you are aware to the fact that we went through 2 extremely unstable years of 4 different rounds of national elections, something that the American system is not familiar with. And the truth is that we never had it in the political history of Israel. It was the first time in the history of Israel that we had to go again and again to the polls in order to elect a parliament. And basically, I had to take a very rapid decision together with the board of the Israeli Reform Movement that once again, I'm trying to start my official political career, and I received the support of my board. And basically, in a few days, I was elected in the Labour primaries. I had to leave my position in the movement after 25 years of service in different capacities. And few weeks after, I became to be the first Reform Rabbi in the Israeli Knesset. And again, personally, and I think also for the entire movement, it was a very intensive, surprising, and exciting transition. My entrance to the Israeli parliament led to a very serious and unpleasant wave of incitement, mainly from the ultra-Orthodox Knesset members, their parties, and unfortunately also from a few players in the Likud parties that actually have a very strong political alliance with the ultra-Orthodox parties. And yet, without suggesting that this wave of incitement should be totally set aside, I really believe that this wave of incitement is a marginal result to a much more dominant phenomena, and that is the ability, our ability today to present the voice of progressive and reform Judaism from the main stage of Israeli politics and governance.
Wow.
And I really believe that, and it's not about me personally. I think that any of my colleagues could have done this a work on behalf of the movement if he, she were in the Knesset instead of me. But the idea that among the 120 parliament members of the Israeli democracy is a Reform Rabbi, and I need to say that another colleague of mine is a distinguished lay leader of the Israeli conservative movement from the Blue and White Party, Professor Alon Tal. Our ability today to present the views, the ideology of our movements in the Knesset, in its committees, our ability actually to be part of the ongoing daily discussion of the main issues Israel is dealing with. This is a tremendous contribution to the presence of our movements, in our case, the Reform movement, in the current Israeli discourse, and especially when we are playing a role inside the coalition. And we are part of parties that belong to the coalition, and different ministers in the government are coming from our parties. And I'll use one example and I'll end this answer. Just think about the impact of the Labour Party having the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. After many years, this ministry was in the hands of orthodox parties. Mm-hmm. Now, the change or the revolution is not happening on one night or on one day, and it takes time. But you already can start to feel the different discourse, the different approach that the current government has towards issues of Israel and diaspora relations. And I think that we will be able to create some historic changes and to achieve strategic achievements in the coming term.
Well, it's so amazing that you're there. I have a few more questions and I'll open up to the chat. People put questions in the chat, but boy, you got to have a strong backbone to take the position that you're doing, to go into that work every day where there are people who really feel opposed to what you represent. And yet, as you mentioned, you're in coalition, and the coalition is such a diverse coalition. Why is it seeming to work? People would argue that this coalition is brittle, that it's going to only last as long until Netanyahu is perhaps convicted and not allowed to run for office again. How brittle is it, and what do you think it can achieve in the time that it has in terms of encouraging democracy, and as we said, freedom of religion and respect for the minority, ultimately, that we believe as Americans true democracies contain?
So first, let's say a few things about how diverse is the current government and the coalition. And as you mentioned, it is an extremely diverse coalition and an extremely diverse government. In many ways, it's the most diverse coalition we ever had. This phenomena of a unity government that brings together right-wing political powers together with left-wing political powers, this is not a unique situation in Israel. Basically, since the 67 war, the 6 Days War, we have this unique political structure. And in many ways, I think that in the last 2 or even 3 decades. We had different types of unity governments most of the time. Still, even if we keep in mind that this is not a new situation, this is by far the most diverse government we ever had. Let's start with the fact that we have 8 different factions in the coalition and in the government. It starts with a party that comes from the deep right, the party of Prime Minister Bennett. Actually, Prime Minister Bennett himself was the president and CEO of the settlers movement, the settlements movement, and it ends not with Meretz, the left-wing Zionist party. It ends with the non-Zionist Arabic party. For the first time in the history of Israel, we have an Arabic party inside the government. We have orthodox parties inside the coalition, and we have secular parties in the coalition. Most sectors of the Israeli society are represented in this government. This government brings socialist parties like the Labour Party or social democratic parties like the Labour Party, together with neoliberal parties from the right. It is extremely diverse, and of course it means that it's not easy to run such a coalition and government. And in order to succeed, we must agree not only on the things that we want to promote together, but also what areas are too sensitive for us in order to create a mega change. And I'm the first one to admit that this is not our dream government. Not as a left-wing Israeli that fully supports the two-state solution, and not as a reform leader that wants to see a separation between the government and the religious establishments. And it's quite clear for me and for my colleagues from day one that, for example, this government will not promote dramatically the two-state solution. It is also clear to us that probably strategic goals of ours in this complicated arena of religion and state, like civil marriage and divorce, will not be fully achieved during the term of this current government. And yet, we do not forget that till a year ago, annexation in the West Bank was a concrete and realistic political option in Israel. We don't forget that former governments ended enormous political and financial powers to the ultra-Orthodox establishment. We don't forget that former governments worked very hard to weaken the Palestinian Authority and to expand the settlements, and created a growing tension with the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C. And also in the area of religion and state, that those governments work very hard to push the non-Orthodox movements back after the collapse of the Kotel Agreement. And when you remember those troubling phenomena from recent years, you understand that even if we are not able to achieve all our goals, we still can achieve real and concrete achievements that will set some kind of foundation for future developments. Annexation is not on the table. There will be no massive expansion of the settlements. You know, we can argue about this place or that place, but basically, it is clear there is not going to be a massive expansion of the settlements. This government renewed the dialogue with the Palestinian Authority. This government is not standing in the way of the Biden administration to renew the direct support for the Palestinian Authority that was massively reduced in the days of the Trump administration. And in religion and state arenas, this government, for the first time in the history of Israel, will support directly the work of the non-orthodox movements. We are working to advance those channels of financial and organizational support through the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, together with my colleague, Dr. Nachman Shai from my party. And in that regard, again, we need to be realistic. It's not our dream government. It is much better, both from the two-state solution perspective and religious pluralism perspective. It is much, much better than the governments we had in recent years.
It's interesting to see that almost a mirror, similar experience between Israel and the United States in terms of governments right now. How interesting. And yet, you mentioned funding for non-orthodoxy, that many of the people online may not know this, nor maybe do I want them to know this, that in Israel, many people don't pay dues to be part of synagogues, but synagogues are paid for out of government budgets. Right? And so when the money's not there, that's what the movement has suffered. So I know you're changing that in how you sit. And yet the government in which you sit, even Mr. Bennett was a leader in the Wall Compromise and creating the egalitarian prayer space. And yet there seems to be kind of a silent slippage there in terms of resolving that issue and making it a wall for everyone, which may be more of a diaspora concern than a domestic Israeli concern. I don't know. So can you address that a little bit? Why isn't that going through? Is it about to go through? How does that add to the fragility of the coalition? Is there fear of pushing that through?
Yeah, look. So when you are part of a political coalition, and I tend to believe this is the case with coalitions in all fields of our life. It doesn't mean that you agree on everything. And it doesn't mean that the original agreements cover all issues. By definition, some issues are left outside the basic fundamental agreements when you establish a coalition. Unfortunately, the issue of the wall, of the Western Wall, was left outside the basic coalition agreements. We tried very hard to include it in the agreements.
So the coalition agreement.
I'm saying it's the Labour Party.
The coalition agreement has to be decided beforehand?
Yes, that's basically not only that this is the political framework for the distribution of positions in the government and the basic guidelines of the government. In Israel, this agreement carries a legal status. Those agreements are being presented in the Israeli parliament, and not like in the American system. The Israeli executive branch is not being elected directly by the people in the polls. It is being elected by the Israeli parliament. This is the parliamentarian system.
Yes.
And it means that there is a vote of confidence in the Israeli parliament in order to approve the establishment of the government and placing the prime minister in his chair. And the Israeli legal tradition is to present those documents to the Knesset. When the government asks the Knesset to support it or to approve it in a vote of confidence. And unfortunately, we didn't succeed in this intensive negotiation to place the issue of the Western Wall as one of the fundamental basic understandings. Now, it doesn't mean that this issue is not on the table. And in recent weeks and in recent months, our bloc in the coalition, the bloc of the Labour Party, Yesh Atid Party, which is led by Yair Lapid, this bloc includes Meretz and Blue and White Party. Our bloc definitely sees the Western Wall compromise as a major component of this government agenda. Unfortunately, the other bloc, the right-wing bloc, which is led by Prime Minister Bennett, identified this issue as a very, very sensitive issue in their, how do you say, target audiences. And right now, there is a debate. I want to be totally transparent. There is a debate inside the coalition. There is a clear understanding that the current situation cannot continue. Even the right-wing parties, even Prime Minister Bennett and the others, understand that the current situation is not acceptable, ending a miserable temporary structure for the use of the non-orthodox groups in the southern parts of the Western Wall. This is not a respectful solution.
Right.
And even those forces in the government that say this is not the time to renew the compromise entirely, admit that major things should be done in order to improve the current situation. We are still waiting to see that those steps are being implemented. And we are still demanding this government to move towards a full implementation of the Kotel Compromise. And here I need to say that what we need to do is to maintain our public and political pressure. I need to do it inside the coalition with my colleagues, and I'm doing it. I'm doing it in a, how to say, in a responsible and sensitive manner, because I do support this government. I think this coalition is much, much better than the alternative. So I need to place the pressure in the right moment and in the right channels. We need world Jewry to maintain tuned to this issue, to remind the representatives of Israel that if this government really wants to heal the wounds that were created by former Prime Minister Netanyahu and his ultra-Orthodox colleagues, we need not nice statements, we real concrete steps. And I tend to believe that as a result of this combined pressure, inside the house and from around the world, we will be able also to bring positive developments around the issue of the wall.
So around concrete steps, as you mentioned, the other day it made into the international news, and it's been playing in the San Francisco papers recently, the issue of settler violence against Palestinians. Attacking peace activists who go to plant olive trees, but then seeing or presenting us that there are two different rules of the law when it comes to violence that Palestinians are responsible for, to violence that Jewish settlers are responsible for. Seeing the same people who attack a knot at the wall, that they're beyond the law. And in the paper the other day, it talked about the police minister saying to the defense minister that the army is supposed to stop this kind of behavior, and the head of the IDF saying it's not our responsibility, and saying that in a place that the IDF controls under international law. How do you respond to that? And then ultimately what leads to this broad statement that we oppose, it's very difficult, declaring Israel to be an apartheid state by Amnesty International.
Yeah. So let's start with the second topic, because it is a very troubling development. But I need to say that here the answer should be clear and strong. Israel is not an apartheid state. People that use this term has no clue what apartheid means. And in many ways, I think they are not respectful towards the suffer of the Black communities in South Africa during those miserable years. Really, it's for me, it's almost unbelievable that a respectful human rights organization has no, how to say, has no intellectual ability to say the things that should be said about the occupation, but not to use harmful cliches. Israel is not an apartheid state by all definitions of what apartheids mean. Now, after saying that, I belong to those that believe that the Israeli control over millions of Palestinians is something that strongly dangerous the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. It's a situation that we cannot accept as advocates of social justice and tikkun olam. This is not a reality that we can embrace as Zionists. It's a true threat for the continuation of the Zionist dream to have a sovereign democratic homeland for Jews and non-Jews in the historic land of Israel. And here I encourage all of you not to leave aside our devotion for the promotion of a two-state solution in spite of the many difficulties. And not all difficulties are connected to the policies of the Israeli government. Many of the current challenges have to do with the Palestinian side. Others are rooted in the Israeli policies. But we are not allowed, as advocates of Zionism and social justice, to leave this vision of two-state solution aside. Now, the situation in the territories is indeed a very complicated and challenging situation. We have 500,000 Israeli citizens that are Israeli citizens, and they want to be treated as Israeli citizens. And as you know, usually it is the police that enforces the law on citizens. Now, they do not embrace our understanding that they live in an occupied territory. They see it as part of sovereign Israel. We understand and we know, and this is the actual truth, that Judea and Samaria are not part of sovereign Israel. And also right-wing governments in the end didn't implement any annexation in those territories besides the unification of Jerusalem immediately after the Six-Day War. Even the Jordan Valley, that enjoys a massive consensus in the Israeli society, or areas like Gush Etzion that enjoy a massive consensus among Israeli Jews, were not brought into or under Israeli sovereignty after the 67 war. And in that regard, those are occupied territories. This is their legal definition. And the army is running the show in this occupied territory, not the police. So we are not willing to embrace this, how to say, washy-wash language. The IDF is carrying the direct responsibility to block any violence in those occupied territories, both from Palestinians, but also from this a group of extreme settlers. I fully accept the notion that this is a minority group among the settlers. I'm fully aware to the fact that the level of Palestinian violence is much higher than the level of Jewish violence toward Palestinians. This is the reality. But I'm responsible to defend the life of Israelis, but we are also responsible to defend the life of innocent Palestinians.
Right.
And in that regard, it doesn't matter which level of violence is higher. The same forces, the IDF and the police, must prevent a Palestinian terror towards Israelis and violence toward Palestinians by Israeli settlers. And here I can say that I, as the chair of the Constitution and Law and Order Committee, held a week ago a very dramatic discussion. The debate between the Ministry of Homeland Security and the chief or head of staff of the IDF was based on things that were revealed in my committee. I'm planning to have another discussion next week, and I demanded the IDF clear answers and not only general statements, numbers and places,
Right.
and clear reports about the way they are going to implement their duty. And we are on this issue. We're not going to let it disappear from our radar.
Well, we are so grateful you're doing this work, and we are lovers of Israel. Our community, as you know, is devoted, and we do not at all see Israel as an apartheid state. But we need to be able to stand up against this kind of perception. It's a perception that has leaked over, of course, into how our youth see Israel, and the disconnect there to perhaps the pressure they feel on college campuses, et cetera, around identity. How would you be encouraging to that group of young people to have a stronger relationship and renewed love of the effort of the state of Israel?
So look, and Rabbi, you and I, we had many discussions in the past. First, I need to say, and that's not the topic of our discussion, and I see it mainly as a domestic issue of North American Jewry, but it's important to say that strong Jewish identity in the 21st century must be based first on personal beliefs and personal practices, and not on the important notion of Jewish peoplehood. I'm including Zionism. I'm not suggesting that Jewish peoplehood, a love for Israel, a sense of belonging to a nation and not only a faith community, those are critical components of Israeli Jewish identity and North American Jewish identity. But in the end, keeping in mind that we are close to celebrate the 74th anniversary of the State of Israel, and 80 years have passed since the end of the Holocaust, and more than 50 years have passed since the Six-Day War, and Soviet Jewry was released 30 years ago. We need to understand that those majestic moments of Jewish life during the 20th century cannot continue to be the core elements of the Jewish identity of the younger generation, not in Israel and not overseas. And it means that we need to invest a lot in convincing our younger generation that Shabbat is relevant to their life, that the study of Torah is relevant to their life, that Tikkun Olam is relevant to their life. And if we have this strong foundation of daily Jewish experiences, we can start to build the second floor that brings the attention of the younger generation to Jewish peoplehood, for Zionism and other collective elements. After saying that, I think that there are two important tools we need to use. First is we need to create an emotional, personal bond of younger Jews to the land of Israel and to the state of Israel. In that regard, I don't think that birthright creates a magic,
No, it doesn't.
but birthright creates a potential that we can then implement. And I think that in the end, the direct experience of young Jews in Israel and with Israelis, it can be in Israel when they come, it can be also in Camp Newman,
Yeah.
or in any other Jewish camp when they meet young Israelis. But the personal experience is critical. The second tool we need to use is the tool of transparency and honesty. Our younger Jews in America needs to know that Israel, like many other and Western democracies, is in an ongoing battle for its identity and values. The battle over the values of our society didn't end in 1948. In many ways, it started only few decades ago, the real battle over the character of Israel.
Right.
Now, the same way we expect them to be lovers of America, in spite of all the challenges you have in America. And you're telling them that they have a special role in the battle over the soul of America. They need to understand that Israel is not a dreamland. Israel is a real land that is dealt with similar and different challenges that other and Western countries, including America, including the US, is dealing with. And in that regard, we need to cultivate them to be players in these battles, in those battles over the soul of the Jewish people and its sovereign homeland. And if the younger Jews will be taught from day one that there are great things in Israel, but there are still many things that we need to do in order to implement our vision, and that they are needed in this battle, even if they are not Israelis.
That's wonderful.
I think it can, yeah. And in that regard, I will only end by saying.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah.
So
No, I just want to add one sentence in
Yeah.
that regard, Rabbi, that in a very surprising way, we see in recent years that the graduates of conservative rabbinical seminars and graduates of conservative educational institutions are more active in anti-Israel movements.
Huh.
And you ask yourself, how come? And then you realize that they were taught from day one that Israel is a dreamland.
Right.
They were not presented with the real challenges of the occupation, of social gaps in Israel, that this is not a state that is only in textbooks.
Right.
It's a real
Reality.
state with problems.
Yeah,
and when
to me,
you're
it's an
saying
interesting
from
thing
day
about
one,
the challenge of realizing we've re-entered history, and that what does that mean, right? So
Yep.
shifting to a couple of questions in the chat, I've kind of been adding into my questions here. One is, what are three things you hope to achieve in this government that you know is a very compromised government? What gives you hope? And secondly, to follow up on the dream part, when we get to it, or you can do it later, is to talk a little bit more about Ethiopian Jewish immigration. That our synagogue has been very much committed to helping support that. And one of our leaders, Jordan Heimwitz, has really garnered support, financial support, and wants to bring people in, and wants Prime Minister Bennett to both bring them in and also come speak at his home synagogue in the United States where his parents were members, Congregation Emanu-El. But start out with what gives you hope. What are a couple of things you want to achieve in the time you'll have as a member of government?
So first, and for me, maybe the most important thing is to change the practical attitude of the Israeli government towards the non-Orthodox movements, mainly in the area of funding and formal recognition. I want to be here very, very clear. I said it many times in Temple Emanu-El and in many other synagogues across North America. I believe in the Zionist idea of setting facts on the ground. I think that in the end, the battle over religious pluralism in Israel will be set by the numbers of Reform and Conservative synagogues operating across the country. The number of young Israelis that choose to become Reform and Conservative rabbis in Israel. And in order to succeed in that, we need to minimize the discrimination of our movements in Israel, both from a legal perspective and also from financial perspective. So my first goal is to make sure that this government starts to support financially the two movements, so we will be able to grow our operation. That's one target. The second target I have was already mentioned, and that's to ensure a major positive development or a jump forward in the Western Wall or around the Western Wall compromise, because I think it's a symbolic issue, but symbols are important. And they have a real influence on different areas. And the third, I'm the head of the Israeli, as I said, Constitution and Law and Order Committee, and I want to promote an expansion of the Israeli Bills of Rights. We are now celebrating 30 years for the legislation of the basic law of human freedom and dignity. This is the Israeli Bills of Rights, but we need to add many more amendments. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the basic concept of equality exist in the Israeli constitutional law, but they are not embedded in the written legislation. And I hope that I will be able to promote an expansion of the Israeli Bills of Rights. And of course, there are many other political goals, but those are the main issues.
Wonderful.
And the other question.
So the other one was that, here many Americans don't realize how diverse Israel is. The different skin tones that make up the Jewish people, having come from all over the world. And yet we know there's still some Ethiopian Jews who are stuck in a horrific situation, have support. Our synagogue's been playing a role to try to bring them in. And so the question is, has Prime Minister Bennett, what can he do to approve the next 3,000 people coming in? It seems like it's a matter of money and not a matter of life.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say this is not a financial issue, okay? It's an issue of immigration policy. Israel has enough financial resources to welcome those olim, those new immigrants, and it should be done. And basically, there is a government decision to welcome all the people that are now in those, I must say, refugees camps in Gundar and in Addis Ababa, and to end this tragedy. And there is a government decision there. The vast majority of ministers, including the ministers of my party, fully support the implementation of this resolution. In recent days, there was a court ruling in Israel forcing the government to suspend this move of bringing those Jews to Israel. And I hope that this legal challenge will be removed shortly. And we are fully committed to bring those Jews in the camps to unite with their families in Israel. I do want to say, and I think it's important again, to have an open and a transparent discussion here. It's important to understand that right now in Ethiopia, there are no Jews or Jews by choice that are that have the right to immigrate to Israel according to the law of return. The Ethiopian Jewish community that met the definitions of the law of return is already in Israel. The vast majority of those, I will say Jews, because I think in the end they are part of our people, even if they don't meet the halachic definition or the definitions of the law of return. I see them as part of the Jewish people. Their main claim to immigrate to Israel is not based on the law of return, but rather on the fact that their family members, their direct family members, siblings, sometimes even parents or children live in Israel. And this is the main justification. One of the challenges we have and one of the fears we have is, where do we draw the line? Because after a few years, again, by definition, there will be people in Ethiopia that can have the same humanitarian claim, again, because now those Ethiopian Jews are citizens of Israel.
Right.
And again, we need to understand Israel in the end is a real country with challenges of immigration policy. And in the end, it's a very delicate discussion. From our perspective, there is no question that the people today in those waiting camps should be brought to Israel. For us, it's a done deal, and there is a government decision. Where do we draw the next line?
Right.
This is a decision we need to take, and it's not an easy one.
Yeah, thanks. One question on the chat is, what can liberal American Jews do to pragmatically support the direction you're championing? Where do we direct our dollars and modest influence? Do NGOs like the New Israel Fund move us in the right direction?
Look, so first of all, from my personal perspective, definitely the New Israel Fund is a very important and a powerful player in the Israeli civil society. They are definitely our partners in the effort to promote religious pluralism. They are deeply involved in the issue of promoting a two-state solution. And they are a very good, let's say, a channel of support for our values and causes in Israel. At the same time, it's important to say that the battle for religious pluralism is not only a battle for the ability of Israelis to enjoy what we all enjoy as Reform Jews. It's a much bigger battle. Without a strong presence of our movement in Israel, it will be very, very hard to promote the values of Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state, the values of Israel's declaration of independence. And I tend to believe that the most important philanthropic cause Reform Jews in America can identify in Israel is to help us to set facts on the ground, to build more Reform synagogues, more Reform schools, to educate more Reform rabbis. Today, I'm glad to say that we are very close to bring also governmental support for this, but the gaps are so big that the philanthropic support must continue. And in that regard, you know, I'm not a banker and I'm not so great in investing my money, but I hear from experts that the most important thing is to have a diverse file of investments. In the end, that's the one, tip that people should carry with them. Don't put your eggs in one basket. And in that regard, I think that wise philanthropic investment in Israel is this investment that brings together different important causes. It can be about Zionist Asbara, it can be about bringing New Olim to Israel, but at the same time, it should include supporting a the pluralistic cause of our movement. If you believe in the two-state solution, definitely groups like the NIF are relevant. Have a diverse file of philanthropic investment in the Jewish community and in Israel.
So our family, for example, we give directly to the IMPJ, the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism. I'd love to see the synagogue here adopt another synagogue, not in Tel Aviv, but somewhere in the hinterlands, to help them step forward. Something that I hope that our leadership group will work on. And certainly we give to NIF and to ADL, to APAC, different groups. And all these groups behind the scenes want to work for the same goals. Wondering on that note, are there Orthodox Israeli Jews who also see an Israeli future that is more religiously diverse and accepting of your perspective?
Yes, definitely yes. Look, I think that one of the positive outcomes of this government is that even if I argue with my colleagues in the coalition from the right-wing Orthodox Party about the Kotel Agreement, we sit in the same coalition. And you need to understand that today, they suffer from the same level of incitement I suffer from because they sit with me. They're being called, you actually became to be a Reform Jew because you're sitting in the same coalition with the Reform Rabbi. So I can argue with them, day and night about the Kotel Agreement and why they don't push forward civil marriage. But in the end, we sit in the same coalition. And in the end, they stand together with me against this wave of incitement. And in the end, even if they don't sign on the Kotel Compromise, they will sign on the governmental support for our movements.
Right.
And again, Rome was not built in one day, and the Jews didn't enter the promised land 1 month after they received the Torah. It took them 40 years. And I'll share with you a story that I find is an amazing story that is taking place right now in Israel. One of the known rabbis of the settlement movement in Judea and Samaria, Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, one of the known rabbinical figures in Israel. He wrote the most popular series of contemporary halachic books. You can find them in all, Orthodox families in Israel. He is an extreme right-wing leader. In the days of the disengagement from Gaza, he called for Orthodox soldiers not to obey orders.
Oh my God.
In the army. So he is far, far, far for the right.
Right.
2 years ago, he took a decision that he wants to start a dialogue with the leaders of the Reform movement.
Wow.
And he started it with leaders from the diaspora community. He had a public discussion with the leading Reform Rabbi in France, an HUC graduate, Rabbi Delphine Riviere.
Right. A woman rabbi.
And since then, he's writing in right-wing Orthodox newspapers about the need to establish a dialogue with the non-Orthodox streams. A week ago, more than 500 ultra-Orthodox and modern Orthodox rabbis signed a petition to boycott him for his relations with Reform leaders.
Wow.
Now, this person has nothing to do with our political philosophy about the territories.
Mhm.
It's from the other side of the sequence.
Right.
At the same time, this prominent rabbi is taking a very courageous step towards a much more pluralistic reality. So in that regard, also people need to understand there is a very surprising dynamic in this field. And the fact that we are in one government with Orthodox right-wing parties is part of this dynamic. And in that regard, yes, we have today also positive developments inside the Israeli Orthodox world.
What's the rabbi's name again?
Eliezer Melamed.
Eliezer Melamed. Wonderful. I'd
From
ask you
the
a question.
settlement Arba.
You probably can't answer this one, but we'll see how good a politician you are. Do you think Minister Lapid will become prime minister?
Yes. I tend to believe he will become prime minister. I honestly do not know if this government will meet its entire term. And you need to know that only two governments in the history of Israel met their full terms.
Okay.
Usually we go to the polls before the government ends its term. It might happen also with Yair Lapid, but I tend to believe he will become the prime minister.
Wow. Thank you so much for coming and being here with us. It was a blessing. Toda rabah lecha. And everybody, thank you so much. The synagogue is going to be reopening Friday night for Friday night services. We hope you'll join us. And we are grateful. If you want to be involved with the Israel Action Committee, please come get involved. Write to myself or Jordan Heimowitz, who's our amazing, amazing leader in this regard, and giving you all blessing. Bye, Gilad.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you.